I was drowning when something impossible reached down and pulled me back into life. The sentence is clean and violent, 3 syllables that cut the ocean open, drowning, and then the impossible rescue that rearranged everything I thought I knew about prayer, providence, and who shows up when we cannot pull ourselves free. I remember the cold first. I remember the thump of my heart against the rib cage like a trapped bird. I remember thinking, with the kind of clarity that happens only when the brain corners itself into survival, that this could be the end of the story I'd been writing for 3 months. The collapse, the shaming, the departure, the loneliness. That morning on La Jolla Beach became the hinge on which everything afterward turned. 3 months earlier, I had a different vocabulary. Our startup, FlowSync, was a word that opened doors. It meant investors, bright conference rooms, late-night pizza boxes, and a whiteboard alphabet of features that felt like prophecy. I can still see the investor deck in my mind. Clean slides, a graph that refused to be modest, a tagline we used without irony. There was champagne the night we closed our Series A. Elena in a red dress, laughing at some joke Marcus made, the city lights of downtown reflected in the glass behind us. We were going to scale, to fix a small, annoying piece of how people manage time and attention, and in doing so, we would be rich in the useful way, useful, necessary, admired. It didn't take long for the narrative of success to fracture. The auditors came in with the slow patience of people who count things until everything looks like a crime. A bug we hadn't anticipated ballooned into a leak of user data. I remember the first Monday after the email landed like an ice pack on my chest. We have discrepancies. Words like compliance and liability and the soft, unavoidable phrase restructure. Marcus and Jennifer, the 2 partners who had become both friends and solvents of my arrogance, began to distance themselves before they left entirely. They packed their things in cardboard boxes in the middle of a Tuesday and told me they needed to protect their reputations. They left the company name on a voicemail and a phrase I can't scrub out of memory. You took a risk that wasn't ours. Everything accelerated into smaller catastrophes. Our landlord's notice, the bank's polite clenched letter, the lawyers saying, "We'll file if we must." The press that had once written warm think pieces began to pose questions in italics. Some nights I slept on a futon under a half-empty bookshelf and woke to the mechanical blue light of my laptop like a finger pointing at everything I had broken. Elena tried to help. She is a clinical psychologist by training, rigorous and tender in ways that made me both grateful and ashamed. She would sit with me and translate my worst thoughts into manageable sentences. "David, you're having panic attacks. Your cortisol level is elevated. Let's set a stabilization plan." She would print articles, outline breathing exercises, schedule follow-ups. I did the breathing. I nodded in the right ways. I wore the prescribed calm like a costume and then took it off when I was alone. Panic doesn't always announce itself like a thunderclap. Sometimes it lives in the background, a low-frequency hum that raises the volume of every negative thought. There were moments when the world felt like an audience, and I had forgotten my lines. My chest would tighten at the simplest stimuli, a ringing phone, a colleague's casual text. Every minor failure felt alchemical. My shame transmuted into a certainty that I was fundamentally unworthy. Elena's patience had limits only because she is human. The morning I checked into the hospital, an ER that smelled of antiseptic and quiet, she sat in an orange vinyl chair and told me with a steadiness I could not match that she could not watch me burn from the inside anymore. She said, "I love you, David, but I can't keep being the person who has to fix every collapse you start." Her voice didn't tremble. It was all the more devastating for being so steady. She left the room gently, closing the door in such a way that the sound of it became the punctuation of divorce. Surrender is not an event. It's a long, thin erosion. For weeks after, I walked the city like a ghost among people still pretending to be alive. I answered emails with slow, deliberately invisible replies that let the world think I was regrouping.
I slept more during the day and could not eat at night. I took walks to La Jolla Beach because the ocean seemed to me a place that held its own indifference in a clean, honest way. You stand against something that does not care whether you live or die, and there is a kind of consolation in that. On the morning of the drowning, I had not planned to swim. I told myself I just needed the sound of the surf. The sky was a high, indifferent blue. A faint maritime smudge of fog clung to the horizon like a dream you haven't finished. La Jolla sand was still cool from the night. I remember a single gull that watched me like a judge. I remember thinking, this is a small thing, just a walk. I had been waking earlier lately because the insomnia and the anxiety yanked me awake with the precision of habit. This time I carried nothing with me but the shirt on my back and a thin, inexplicable hope that the water might wash something clean. I knew the ocean enough to respect it. I had been a swimmer in college, not a champion, but enough to register the language of tides, the way a beach could present itself as friendly and then with a pulse change its mind. There was a rip current that morning, lying parallel to the shore and soft as a belt of darker water. It was subtle to the untrained eye, just a patch where the waves rejected the shore's invitation to roll, yet powerful.
When I stepped in, the water took my legs as though it had decided I might be better somewhere else. Panic rises in technical stages. The first logic that says, float, conserve energy. Then the second where cognitive resources fray and memory starts to fragment. My lungs remembered oxygen. Then they remembered nothing at all. The world contracted to the rhythm of my breath and then to the space between heartbeats. Sounds muffled into a distant clamor, voices from the beach becoming like a radio with the wrong station. I tried to swim parallel to the shore as I'd been taught. Swim along the current until you find a break. My arms, which had once carried me through practice sets and collegiate meets, stalled like pistons in sand. Each stroke became heavier, each breath a negotiation. And then the sensation that makes the mind throw up the white flag. The world tilting on its axis, the sky folding, and the idea of giving up presenting itself not as cowardice but as mercy. The faint thought that if I stayed still, the dark would come sooner and kinder. I could feel my limbs grow heavy, as if gravity had slipped into molasses. In that suspended, awful clarity, time lengthened. The sound of waves came as a slow drum. Flashbacks pushed through without warning. Elena's hand on my cheek. Marcus laughing in the conference room. A voicemail where someone said the word bankruptcy as if it were a neutral fact. The ocean was now a theater in which all my mistakes performed their final acts. Then I saw the light. The first thing to say about the being is that it did not look like what movies always promise an alien will look like. It did not arrive on a platform of metal or make a theatrical statement. It moved through the water like a current itself, as if the water had been briefly and locally enlightened. At first it was a point, a glow like bioluminescent plankton seen up close, but warmer, not cold, almost sodium gold. It had no visible face in any human sense, but there was the suggestion of a head and shoulders, a humanoid silhouette composed of moving light. There were no ripples where it passed. The water seemed to part around it with a courtesy that was almost audible, like curtains sliding. I did not have words for the sound of being made. It was not music or language. It was more like the ocean deciding to hum. The frequency pressed against my skull and, weirdly, did not hurt. Instead, it seemed to unlace panic from around my thoughts. I remember thinking that the sensation was familiar because it felt like childhood naps, like my mother's voice speaking softly in the dark to calm a fevered dream. In that moment, the instinct to claw, to panic dissolved. My arms stopped thrashing. The being came to me as if to a ship that had lost its anchor. It reached, not in a holding way, more as if it were providing a route. A shape of light slid beneath me, warm against a skin that had forgotten warmth. Once it had me, motion resumed not as frantic thrashing, but as a purposeful sweep toward shore. There was no effort in its movement the way a human swimmer expresses effort. No spray, no wake. Instead, the water seemed to ripple with faint blue filaments that evaporated into the foam. It felt like being held in the palm of the ocean itself. I have a small scar behind my right ear from childhood stitches. When my consciousness unclenched enough to observe detail, I noticed the smell of ozone and something like fresh linen. I felt an almost tactile sense of someone watching over me, not watching in a way to be judged, but in a way that registers and responds. The being's presence did something to my memory. Traces of the startup life bled into the sensation of being carried. It was as if a long chain of earlier mistakes and frantic attempts to fix them was being unhooked one by one, each releasing like a bell. There was no conversation of words. Instead, there were impressions that arrived like colored lights on a board. A sense that my name had an echo in some other registry. A flicker that implied coordination somewhere else. An image, brief and skein-like, of people in different rooms doing little kindnesses that multiplied into rescue. It was not theology in the explicit sense. It was an experiential impression that an intelligence could influence outcomes by assembling willing human responses. I knew immediately and with a childish, almost ridiculous certainty that what I had experienced was not merely a mechanical rescue, but threaded through with intentional help that resembled prayer answered. The being set me down on the sand with the gentleness of a librarian closing a book. The contact between water and sand was sudden and complete. I gasped in air like a man reintroduced to speech. For a long beat, I lay on my stomach, palms digging into cold sand, tasting salt and earth and a thin metallic tang. Muscles that had been wrenched to the edge of collapse began to twitch. I rolled onto my back and saw that the slope of the beach was dotted with faces now. People who had been walking, reading, tying shoes, turning toward the surf with expressions that cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then kindness. "Hey, you okay?" a voice called. It came from a man in a windbreaker about 30 feet down the beach. He had the kind of face that looked like he had 1,000 tiny rules about public behavior and only occasionally strayed from them. He jogged toward me. His name later would be Tom Rodriguez. He didn't ask for my documentation or my investment thesis. He simply touched my shoulder and said, "You gave us a scare." I could barely form the words. My mouth tasted like lead. The sentence broke apart. I tried to tell him about the light, about the being that had carried me, but the voice that came out sounded like a child reporting a dream. Tom's face tightened in that way people tighten when someone else says something that barely fits their category of the real. "You're hypothermic, maybe," he said, practical now. He looked over his shoulder at the rest of the beach. Someone was on a phone, someone else was getting a towel. He helped me sit up. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. My fingers found something in the sand, a smooth object, cool and strangely luminous where the light hit it. I had no memory of picking it up. It was a small stone, no larger than a walnut, but its surface held a depth that made me think of the ocean's darkest places. And when I cradled it, the glow that had been in the water seemed to fold into that palm-sized sphere. "How'd this get here?" I muttered. Tom looked at the stone as if a truck had parked on the beach. He didn't say the obvious, which was, no one drops stones that glow. He did, however, call the number of the lifeguard station on his cell phone. "Hey, we got someone who needs checkup," he said, keeping his voice steady. The lifeguard's reply was the same sort of professional flatness that people reach for in emergencies. "We'll send dispatch." Somewhere in the background, a small boy was wailing, and a woman was saying, "Shh, it's okay." The world was reconstituting itself into familiar forms, even as a new, strange thing had intruded into the scene. People were around me now. Someone wrapped a towel around my shoulders. Another offered a bottle of water.
Elena's face, in the faint possibility I might make sense of it, did not appear. For some reason I had been expecting her, like old habit expects its lover to appear in the doorway, but she did not. I tried to put the morning into categories as they arrived. In my head, the checklist scraped at the edges of sense. Hypothermia, salt ingestion, panic-induced amnesia. None of those things accounted for the feeling I had of being lifted by will rather than force. None of them explained the way the water had parted. None accounted for the stone in my hand that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. At one point, the lifeguard asked me if I had been drinking. He had the blunt, almost paternal tone of a person who sees a lot in a day. I didn't have a good answer. "No," I said, listening to how small my voice sounded. "You're shivering," he said. "You're lucky someone saw you go out. Rip currents are dangerous." A woman with a camera phone had already recorded the scene. I watched, half dreaming, as the clip made its way in microseconds to other people's feeds. Slices of my near death being processed by an indifferent algorithm. The footage, later, would become one of the things investigators would ask to see. For that morning, it was simply a witness that a thing had happened. I wanted to explain the being, but the words fled. There is a vocabulary for waves and riptides and currents. None of that vocabulary had verbs that fit the thing that had reached down and answered me.
When I tried to tell Tom the phrase that seemed to be balancing on the edge of my mind, an impression rather more than a sentence, that there were helpers who coordinated with a farther intelligence, he cocked his head in that polite way that says, "I'm listening, but I'm not committed." He asked if I'd been taking medication. I had no convincing medical history to offer. The hospital gave me fluids, checked my vitals, and provided 2 towels and an account number I did not want. I was small in a large system. The sea had been enormous and unknowable, and then intimate in the way it offered its hand. The closest word to my experience, the one that later shaped how I tried to tell people what happened, was this: assistance. Not miraculous in a headline sense, not flashy, assistance, as if some network, some architecture of care had wrenched its attention toward the point where I had failed to care for myself. The day's aftertaste was a thin line of wonder and deep confusion. People offered practical things: rides, cups of coffee, a nurse named Angela who insisted I get checked out at urgent care. Tom insisted on walking with me to the parking lot until I steadied. At the car, he took off his windbreaker and wrapped it around my shoulders again, as if our bodies, in that gesture, could stitch a life back together. When I finally sat in the passenger seat of a stranger's car, the stone was still warm in my palm. I turned it over and over as if I could wring meaning from texture. It wasn't heavy, just dense, inscribed with the kind of tiny grooves that suggested being shaped by water over a very long time. The light inside it was faint. It responded to my attention the way a wayward pup responds to a whistle. I don't want to say the stone spoke to me because that's an easy line to ridicule, but there was a precise impression, a mapping rather than a language, that something had been placed into my life not to explain, but to remind. You were seen. Afterwards, as the adrenaline waned, proof began to matter in ways it hadn't in the moment of rescue. Memory is unreliable after such events. The brain stitches holes in ways that flatter the teller. But I am someone who works in evidence, numbers, contracts, audit trails. So I did what my training recommends in the wake of the inexplicable: gather the available facts. I asked Tom for his name. He gave it readily, the same way people hand you their names when they remember that human decency still prescribes the exchange. He told a friend to fetch the beach's logbook and a witness down the pier who had later remarked at the oddness of the water. Small facts accumulated: a time-stamped video clip, a lifeguard's dispatch record, a brief note in the beach's incident log. None of it explained the light. None of it spoke for the warm hand that had guided me. That evening, unable to sleep, I sat up and wrote down what I remembered. I dated the entry. I wrote with a trembling specificity because dates in my business make things more real. July 12, La Jolla Beach, 6:17 a.m., near drowning, assisted by unknown luminous helper. Stone recovered, now in possession. I wrote the words assistant and coordinator and then crossed them out because they felt presumptuous. Nobody wants to be someone who tells the story that strains credibility. There is humiliation in wonder when no one to attest to it reads the same page. The first time I tried to tell Elena, she gently, clinically separated the experience into plausible categories. Dissociative episode, sleep deprivation, something that happens under extreme stress. In her voice there was both compassion and a professional restraint born of training. Test, measure, rule things out. She didn't scoff, but she didn't affirm the vision either. Later, when I would press the matter with more insistence, she would ask me to consider therapy notes and to get checked for concussion or seizure. She did not hold the rarer possibility as central to her diagnosis. That night, I held the stone under my pillow as if proximity might keep whatever had touched me from dissolving. It pulsed faintly when the moonlight grazed the window. I fell asleep thinking of small things. Elena's laugh at a friend's wedding, the sound of a conference room projector, the way Marcus once taped a paper fortune to my laptop that said, "Scale like you deserve to." In sleep, I dreamed of corridors full of doors and the sense that someone else was walking a parallel hallway, opening doors that led to places where help could happen. The morning after the rescue, the world required accounting. I had messages, some solicitous, some clinical. I had a notification that one of the local news channels had run a segment with grainy footage pulled from someone's phone. Strangers were already speculating in comment threads. Dramatic rescue. Faking it for likes. Jesus saves, one person wrote, and then a cluster of emojis that betrayed the cheapness of reduction. I began, slowly and through careful movement, to collect the things that could be collected. The beach log, Tom's number, the lifeguard's report, the footage. Each piece was a small shrine to an event that didn't fit easily into the taxonomy of the world. I took the stone to a small jeweler we used to know, someone who understood things about luster and age, and he turned it over with the solemnness of someone who measures an object's quiet worth. "Looks like something smoothed by the sea," he said, non-committal. He could tell me nothing about why it occasionally brightened when my fingers tightened around it. But the stone was not content to be an inert curiosity. When I held it and let my mind be quiet, there would come impressions that were not my thoughts, but not fully other either. Images like frames flashing on a screen. A woman in a hospital corridor suddenly remembering a needed medication. A teacher prompted to forgive a child and thereby keep them from a spiral. Small, almost trivial nudges that resulted in lives not being derailed. The sensation was not that the stone told me these things in words, but that it offered the possibility of a mechanism, a way in which small human volitions could be amplified into salvation. It was an idea that rode along with the rescue, fragile as blown glass. What if help arrives sometimes through networks we barely perceive? Even then, part of me wanted to reduce the extraordinary to the ordinary. My mind kept producing hypotheses with the stubbornness of a lawyer. Perhaps some unusual bioluminescent organism lingered in the water. Perhaps the video had been manipulated. Perhaps the stress had colored the memory. I kept the hypotheses as much for my own sanity as for credibility. The world likes simple arcs. Bad thing, human solution. It resists mysteries because they threaten the order we take for granted. The days that followed the rescue were a blur of small interrogations. A reporter from a local paper wanted to interview me. I refused. Tom and I ate coffee and breakfast at a diner near the pier, where the waitress slid a plate in front of me as though feeding a man who had seen his own mortality. "You look better," she said. I wasn't sure if that was meant as encouragement or a lie meant to be comforting. People asked if I wanted to press charges or file a formal complaint. I didn't know who to blame. The being that had saved me had not hurt anyone. In a place that often put fingers to scales, there was nothing to weigh.
And yet, the fact that a being had intervened begged the question that sits at the center of faiths. Why me? Why then? Why this thin, flawed instrument of a person who had burned his life on hubris and neglect and mismanaged risk? The theologies offer frameworks: trial, test, chastening, purification. The marketplace of explanations offered convenience, coincidence. I did not find convenience satisfying. That tension between a scientific appetite for evidence and a human hunger for meaning would come to define what followed. I am not a person who wants to become a zealot, nor do I relish being the kind of story other people like to untangle on forums because he had an experience. I wanted answers that fit both the courtroom and the cathedral. I wanted investigators to catalog the phenomenon without reducing it to gossip. I wanted Scripture's language to be respected without being coerced into explaining a glowing helper in the surf.
I began, in those early days, to keep a journal with a kind of double-entry ledger, the left-hand column for the facts, times, names, witnesses, the right-hand column for the impressions, the warmth felt, the sense of being noticed, the image flashes like cinematic cuts that belonged to an order I could not yet name. I dated each entry and circled the words assist and coordination when they appeared. I underlined the one called Jesus when that image rose in my mind, not as theologians' assertion, but as the felt sense of a presence, like a vast, benevolent pattern in the world. It is important here to honor the fact that my language is tentative. The rescue had the hallmarks of an intelligence aware of human categories. It recognized the name Jesus in my memory and responded with something like alignment. I cannot say with the authority of doctrine that Jesus directed the being. What I can say is that the impression I carried was of a coordination that fit, in my soul, into a story I had been taught since childhood, that God's attention can manifest in subtle, distributed ways. The internal argument, scientist versus believer, skeptic versus witness, played out like a tug of war in my head. I went to bed one night and woke with the same thought. There must be a readable thread between the rescue and other instances where help arrives just in time. I had noticed for years the small miracles that pass unnoticed. The paramedic who happens to be 2 blocks away when someone collapses. The stranger who happens to stop and hand you your dropped keys. The donor who reads about a need and decides to give. We call these coincidences or acts of human kindness. What if some of them were nudged? What if an auxiliary, what I had seen in the surf, was part of a broader architecture of assistance that worked through human will as levers? The idea felt incendiary and ridiculous by turns. It also felt like something that explained part of my recovery arc without giving me carte blanche to avoid responsibility. If some external force helps, that does not remove the human obligation to be awake to the nudge, to be the hands that answer. If anything, the presence of help, revealed to me in the most literal bodily way, made the moral stakes sharper. I had been given a reprieve. What would I do with it? As the days widened, the stone became a private locus of meditation. It sat on my kitchen table wrapped in a piece of cloth like a relic. When the light hit it, there was an inner shimmer. At night, I would close my eyes and try to recall the rescue precisely. How the being moved, the smell of the air, the pressure in my chest. The memory was generous with sensory detail. It refused the tidy forms of explanation. It gave me images that sat like prayer against the rigid scaffolding of my skepticism. Then, one afternoon, a small, polite knock at my door. Tom had actually become a bridge. He brought, with the tentative confidence of someone who had done a good deed and wanted to see it end well, a typed copy of the beach log he'd taken a photo of. He leaned against my hallway and said, "There are a lot of things in this world we don't have names for." He was not trying to console. He wanted me to know he believed I had been in trouble and someone or something had rescued me.
The log had an entry, time-stamped, about a rescue. It was thin, bureaucratic, not poetic. Adult male, possible rip current, assisted to shore. The writing was buttoned up in a way officials make things when they are trying not to add horror to a day. But there it was, a public document that said something had happened. Together with Tom's footage and the lifeguard's note, it gave me a chain of verifiable events. I felt the lessening of solitude when evidence accrues. And yet, the loneliness was philosophical. If a luminous being can reach into the surf to save me, why does a city full of people still suffer? Why doesn't the pattern scale up to prevent tragedies en masse? The rescue raised as many questions as it answered. In the yawning space between the rescue and explanation, an uncomfortable responsibility took root. The beings, if they were beings, did not do the heavy lifting of moral choice. They nudged, they offered opportunities, but someone had to act. At some point that month, I walked back to La Jolla with the stone in my pocket and sat where the wave-edge-studded sand was cool. The tide was not high. Children were building a fortress out of wet sand, their parents keeping a low, watchful eye. A woman in a hospital scrubs walked past and dropped a small paper cup of coffee without noticing. I watched as a young man bent down to pick it up and hand it to her. Where did the impulse come from? Was it a mirror of what I'd seen, a tiny human act carried into consequence? The question again, if the architecture of help exists, how do we participate? On a bench near the walkway, an older woman sat with a grocery bag. She had the look of someone who had once been useful. Hands stained slightly, posture that suggested habitual movement. I found myself offering to carry her bag back to her car. She looked at me like she had expected nothing and then accepted with a small, surprised smile. Inside me, the memory of being lifted on the surf rose, not as a demand, but as a call. The stone in my pocket pulsed faintly, almost as a metronome counting the slow rhythm of small kindnesses. The rescue had not resolved my mistakes. FlowSync remained in legal limbo. Marcus and Jennifer had moved on to new projects. Elena and I were not reconciled. She had moved out of the apartment we shared and left me with a box of her books and a note that said, "Find help." The humiliation of failure sat like a bruise I kept hitting against. The being had given me a visceral, physical second chance, but it did not erase the accounting I owed, financial, relational, and spiritual. That accounting is the marrow of the months that followed. I would learn, painfully, that rescue, even if it comes from a place we cannot name, does not replace the work of repair. It clarified something for me that would become central. Help is often coordinated rather than absolute. It invites participation rather than abdication. The being in the surf had performed the impossible act of getting me to shore. But once on land, the world expected me to be the one to stand. I kept the stone on a small plate in the kitchen, under a beam of afternoon light. Sometimes I would pick it up and feel small images. A child's cough stopped because of a timely medicine. A surgeon delayed leaving because of a phone call that prompted a check. A neighbor deciding at a bus stop to call a number he had seen in an old flyer. The images were not proof. They were impressions that pulled at me like a tide. Before very long, people outside my immediate circle began to reach out. Tom stayed in contact. A woman named Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, a neighbor 2 blocks over who had seen the footage online, dropped off a casserole. An old college teammate left a voicemail saying something that made me laugh. "You always did like drama, but this is a new extreme." Those gestures were small and practical, and in their sum, they did something human. They kept me tethered to possibility. There is an ethical danger here. To take an extraordinary experience and turn it into a tale that erases real human need with mystical answers. I was determined, against whim, to keep both strands in view. The being had rescued me. The city and its ordinary mechanisms, strangers, lifeguards, a diner waitress, had continued the work of saving me. The two were not mutually exclusive. If anything, their interplay became the most interesting question. Where did the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary meet? At the end of that first month after the surf, I had a folder of documents. The beach log, Tom's footage, a printed email from the lifeguard station, a photograph of the stone. I had a list of small vignettes. The woman at the hospital who later wrote me a note. The boy whose wailing had been hushed by a stranger. And the waitress who had given me a free cup of coffee because she remembered a night when someone else had done the same for her. I could not put these stories into a rigorous causal model. There were too many variables, too many human wills at play. Still, something in me had shifted. The rescue had cracked me open in the soft, painful place where vanity and denial live. And then, one morning while I was still attempting to balance curiosity with the obligation to be circumspect, I received a call that would begin to stitch the rescue into a different fabric. It was brief. A number from a research institute I had only ever noticed on funding panels, an organization with a reputation for careful marine work and a name that rustled in a way some names do when they're associated with formal credibility. The woman on the phone introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Hendress. She asked me gently if we could talk about the event at La Jolla. At the time, her call felt like the nudge that starts a new chapter. I told her, cautiously, about the rescue. She listened and then asked a few procedural questions: the precise time, whether I had been taking any medications, the names of any witnesses. When I mentioned the stone, there was a pause on her end that was professional but not uncurious. "We study unusual bioluminescent events," she said finally. "I would be interested to examine anything you have." It is one thing to be rescued. It is another to have the rescue cross from the realm of private wonder into the domain of public inquiry. The call from Dr. Hendress felt like the hinge moving again. What had been my private experience might be, finally, an event that merited external attention. I agreed to meet her. I didn't yet know how the meeting would bend the story, but I felt a cautious hope that my rescue would not be reduced to the lonely status of an anecdote. That night I slept with the stone on the nightstand. It pulsed, faint and patient, like a calm heartbeat at the edge of sleep. In the dark I could still feel the being's hands, or rather the impression of hands, and the warm sense that somewhere else a set of people were being nudged into acts that added up to rescue. I did not yet have the words to explain whether those nudges were metaphysical or mechanical, but the experience had rearranged the axis of my life. From performance and profit to, at minimum, a possibility that my life could be repurposed for service. The next morning I woke with the sort of clarity that lives between the surreal and the urgent. There would be questions to ask and forms to fill, people to meet who would neither dismiss nor uncritically affirm. The rescue had opened a seam in my life that would not stop leaking questions. Dr. Hendress's call was the first careful hand extended through that seam. She suggested an appointment at the Institute. Scripps had a small satellite lab near the harbor, offices that smelled faintly of coffee and ethanol, whiteboards full of annotated graphs, and in a back room a cabinet of instruments that looked like the instruments of a future rather than a myth. I drove there with the stone in a padded case, under the weird, protective feeling that accompanies carrying something a little too important for the pockets of ordinary days. Her office was spare and efficient. She had the conversational rhythm of a person who asks one useful question after another and keeps the rest in reserve. We sat under a poster of kelp forests and talked through chronology, dates, witnesses, the weather, anything that narrowed down variables. When I described the being, she listened in a way that honored my experience without granting it mystical immunity. "We work with anomalies," she said, almost apologetically. "Sometimes there are biological phenomena we don't expect. Sometimes instrumentation picks up electromagnetic events near shore. I can't promise you anything, but if there is an object, we can characterize it." We moved to the lab. Dr. Hendricks introduced me to a pale, thoughtful man who shook my hand with slow assurance, Dr. Robert Chen. He had the exacting demeanor of someone who had spent time in places where a misplaced decimal point makes an otherwise elegant theory crash. He looked at the stone as if it were a worthwhile puzzle and set about cataloging it with the small rituals of a scientist. An initial photograph, weight and size, a note on the paper log. The stone wasn't loud. It sat in its foam cradle, apparently inert. It might have been just a little, unusual pebble. Dr. Chen ran a battery of benign tests first: hardness, refractive index, a bit of acid to get at mineral content. He was careful to narrate as he worked, both for my sake and for the record. "We do this to establish baseline composition. We'll run spectroscopy and an electron microprobe if warranted." The spectrometer returned odd results, an internal structure that refracted light in ways that suggested layered nanostructures, things that glowed under specific wavelengths. The readings did not match common mineral charts. "This is not a simple calcium carbonate," Dr. Chen murmured. "There are organic signatures, but they aren't what I'd expect from known marine biota." He was the sort of professional who kept his vocal astonishment small. He tapped a key and the screen unfolded lines of data. Peaks where peaks shouldn't be. A faint but measurable electromagnetic field when the stone was placed near a coil of copper. "Minimal output," he said, "but quantifiable." He set up a sensitive magnetometer, an EMF array, and a Faraday cage to rule out environmental interference. He also asked the lab's neurophysiologist to stand by. The idea, he explained, was to record my own neural patterns concurrently if I were to handle the stone again, perhaps simply because the human-non-human interaction might show entrainment. I felt ridiculous, like the subject of a strange documentary. At the same time, I felt an odd, rising certainty that if the stone had anything to tell me, it would do so under the patient machinery of calibrated instruments. "I need you to be honest about any substances," Dr. Chen said. His tone was not accusatory. He was thorough. I swore, truthfully, to the best of my knowledge. There were no drugs. My panic meds were long since stabilized under Elena's watch. I was, in the lab's lights, reasonably ordinary. We recorded baseline EEG readings of my brain while I sat with a cup of bad coffee and tried not to be performative. The technicians were gentle with me. When the devices were dialed in, Dr. Chen asked me to hold the stone in my palm and to clear my mind as best I could. It felt like a trivial enough request, so I complied. The stone warmed to my skin with a softness, an almost imperceptible hum that the instruments picked up as a low-frequency oscillation. The equipment did what the equipment always does. It refused to perform the comforts of revelation and instead presented a ledger of correlations. My EEG showed a shift. Theta frequencies increased slightly, an entrainment pattern that looked like what happens in meditative states. The magnetometer recorded microvolt changes in the nearby coil. The spectrometer registered a surge at a narrow band of frequencies that corresponded to biophotonic emissions, light produced by organisms at very low intensities. Dr. Chen leaned in, squinting at a monitor. "It's as if the stone and the brain are oscillating into phase for a few seconds," he said. "The field is weak but coherent." I tried to put words to what happened next and could only offer what the stone brought me. Brief, cinematic impressions, no sentences. A corridor where a surgeon hesitated. A child's inhaler left in the wrong place. A number bookmarked in the back of a civic ledger. As the images flared in my mind, the instruments recorded synchronized spikes. The lab room hummed with a low, precise whir of refrigeration units and a more human sound. Dr. Chen, softly, saying, "David, what did you just see?" I tried to be cautious in my answer. "I saw a surgeon remembering a clamp," I said, my voice small. A textbook dropped in a classroom that leads to a conversation. A woman in a corridor who checks a chart. It sounded absurd next to the hardware, but the traces on the screen were not. The technician printed a runout graph that showed my theta wave increase precisely at the moments the EMF and photonic sensors recorded their pulses. The phenomenon repeated on cue, a small set of harmonized spikes every time I let the stone rest in my palm and let the images come. Dr. Chen, who had come at the case with the clinical distance of a man used to chasing data, leaned back and let out a breath that was half laugh, half exhale. "This is not data that proves metaphysics," he said. "It proves an interaction between a human neural signature and a physical object that emits coherent energy. The relationship between that and your subjective experiences is what we can call an anomalous correlation, an observation that merits further study." He was careful to bracket his amazement. He ran control tests with other volunteers who had no known prior contact with the stone. Some showed no neural entrainment. Others showed a similar, though attenuated, mirroring of patterns without the vivid imagery I'd experienced.
The conclusion was stubbornly intermediate. There was something measurable. How to explain it? Not scientifically sufficient to claim an anthropic director of affairs, but not nothing. Several weeks of testing followed. The stone's emissions varied in spectral pattern depending on proximity and on my emotional state. When I was calm and open, the field read as a cleaner signal. Dr. Chen and his team recommended careful documentation, video records, witness statements, precise timestamps. They forwarded their reports to colleagues and put me in touch with a few cautious experts who would come to examine the readings. Dr. Hendress, for her part, remained a steady, open-minded presence. She oscillated between curiosity and the practiced wariness of someone who had seen many strange waves flatten into human explanations. The media interest was contained after my initial refusal to speak to reporters, but it did not entirely abate. People messaged me, some with stories of what they called miracles, others with skepticism. Friends offered both comfort and practical advice. Tom remained a friend in that careful neighborhood way where someone does not make you recount your trauma but simply brings vegetable soup on a Tuesday. The local Coast Guard, to their credit, filed records that corroborated the timeline. Dispatch logs and lifeguard reports were stamped and filed. Part of the bureaucratic scaffolding that gave me small things to lean on when memory felt like a room with missing beams. The stone pressed on in the days as if it were quietly teaching me how to pay attention. In the lab, it produced readings that suggested a low-energy emitter with unique nanostructure. The analysis hinted at compounds that oxidized differently than typical rock. Dr. Chan proposed that, in some sense, the stone functioned as a transducer. It converted a subtle, perhaps patterned field into sensations that matched human cognitive architecture. He used phrases like entrainment and resonant coupling with an engineer's humility, models that offered mechanisms without metaphysics. The qualitative part, the part that made Dr. Chen tilt his head, was when we tried something new. He produced a headset with EEG leads and asked me if I would try a controlled experiment. I would hold the stone, the room would be darkened, and we would attempt to map whether the images I described could be tied to external, verifiable events. He called it, practically, a signal-to-event correlation study. We enrolled a small team, solicited a few witness statements from people in urban roles, nurses, teachers, bus drivers, then placed the dates and times associated with my imagery on a list and tested whether actions corresponded. At first, the method felt like a game with too much at stake. Then, improbably, one of the images I described came true. I had seen, 10 minutes into one session, a vignette of a surgeon in a downtown hospital pausing before a procedure because he clicked an extra box on a form, an action minor enough to be unrecorded usually. We flagged the time. Dr. Chen sent a careful, non-leading inquiry to a surgeon contact at St. Bartholomew's, Dr. Sarah Kim, asking if anything unusual happened on a specific date and time.
She replied with an email that was as precise as her scalpel. She had, that morning, been about to sign a consent form before an operation, hesitated, checked a dosage on a chart that was out of place, and thereby caught a mismatch that prevented a dosage error. She did not attribute it to anything other than a procedural pause. She did, however, forward a terse clinical note that matched the timestamp Dr. Chen provided. These small convergences accumulated into a pattern that was neither clean proof nor purely anecdote. The lab's conservative phrasing, anomalous correlations meriting broader study, sat like a plank of wood across a stream. It bridged, temporarily, the bank of scientific denial and the bank of spiritual wonder. Dr. Chen continued to insist that we are a species built on patterns, and that pattern recognition can conflate coincidence with design. He was guarded in his language. Yet when he stood in front of the monitor and saw a spike coinciding with a verified action, his manner softened into the human astonishment that Kate would get when someone ran a blade along a new stone and found a vein of silver. One evening, after a long day of data logging, Dr. Chen left me alone in the observation room with the stone and an envelope of the day's printed charts. I picked up the small object and let myself be quiet. The images came without effort now, like postcards arriving in a mailbox. This time, the montage settled into a longer sequence. A school nurse finding a child's backpack with a letter that prompts an intervention. A bus driver stopping a bus 2 blocks early because of a call that rerouted him. A mechanic in an alley deciding to stay an extra hour and thereby being present when a neighbor's child has a seizure. Small human forks that, when someone chose them, prevented catastrophes. In the lab logs, those moments often matched with minor but consistent EM spikes. Dr. Chen called them coincidence clusters and put them in a spreadsheet with asterisks and question marks. The pattern was not universal. Sometimes the stone produced soft, private reveries with no public parallel. Sometimes instruments hiccuped and the stone returned no signal at all. The ambiguity kept me tethered to humility. What the stone seemed to reveal, if that is the right verb, was a model of assistance that depended on human freedom. The images suggested always a human hinge, a person noticing something and acting. The auxiliary's role, as it had been impressed on me that morning in the surf, felt like a nudge in the margin rather than a direct override. It nudged the available person into an action that, in the chain of the world, could ripple. The lab gradually widened its circle of inquiry. Dr. Hendricks convened a small panel, an ethicist, a neurologist, a social worker, and a liaison from the Coast Guard to discuss implications. People asked careful questions. If we assume there is a mechanism that nudges people, who decides whom to nudge? Why some people and not others? Are there harms in nudging? The answers remained largely philosophical. The ethicist raised the obvious concerns, agency and consent. Dr. Hendricks' reply was simple. From what we can tell, the nudges do not compel. They seem to amplify an existing openness. At the same time, the public story around my rescue evolved into tentative curiosity. Tom's footage surfaced in a longer piece that stuck remarkably to the facts and avoided sensational language. The Coast Guard filed their own notation in an internal report about an anomalous bioluminescence call that morning. It read like the kind of bureaucratic curiosity that quietly admits it saw something it cannot fully name. More than once, I found myself grateful for the institutional modesty of public servants who gather facts in order not to derive metaphysics from adrenaline. Then came the deeper interior revelation that changed the shape of my returning days. In a private session with the stone, when the lab observed the usual entrainment and recorded the corresponding EM and neural signatures, an image arrived that had a coherence beyond the fractured vignettes. It was a felt communication, not a phrase, but an arrangement of meaning that my mind translated into a sentence. We coordinate with the one you call Jesus. It arrived like a scent that implies a memory, Not a doctrinal proposition, but a relational orientation. The impression was not that the beings were divine, nor that they supplanted the God of Scripture. It was that they worked in a way that, to my sense, matched the patterns I had learned as a child about God's care. Distributed, relational, mediated through human hearts. When I told Dr. Chan about this, he blinked and pushed his glasses up his nose. "That's a theological interpretation on the data," he said carefully. "Scientifically, we can document correlations. The meaning you receive is yours, and we should treat it as subjective material. But the correlation remains fascinating." His reserve was not dismissal. It was professional caution. He was not a man to sign away his methods for meaning. I told Elena because honesty between us had become a new test. She had skirted back into my life like someone testing whether the sea was calm enough to wade in. A text, then a coffee, then a lengthier conversation in which she kept one foot in the clinic. She did not mock my description of beings who coordinated with the one called Jesus. Rather, she asked me, in that measured, clinical voice, what I intended to do with the knowledge.
"If it's true or if it's not," she said, "what matters is whether you act with care. Does it make you kinder, safer, more responsible?" Her question felt like a gauntlet and a gift. The revelation, whether spiritual, psychological, or an artifact of my unique neurophysiology interacting with a mysterious object, placed me at a fork. I could imagine the stone as a ticket back to vanity, a proof to be hustled for attention and profit. Or I could let it be what it seemed to want to be, a reminder that someone had noticed my failure and extended help, and that my gratitude ought to take the form of service. My life at this point was not made neat by revelations. FlowSync remained in legal and financial stasis. Lawyers still drafted documents that reminded me of my culpability. But the psychological tilt had shifted. I was, by small degrees, becoming available. That word, available, would anchor the months ahead. I began to practice available minutes, short periods in which I intentionally put aside schedules and devices and was ready to act on simple impulses to help. I volunteered at a community clinic once a week and offered a few hours at the local shelter. I learned to notice the tiny lights that people carry and to be alert when someone in the periphery of my life seemed about to fall. Those practices provided the soil for the revelation's translation into daily life. One rainy afternoon, I saw Mrs. Dorothy Patterson slip on the ice near the corner store. She was the woman who had once brought a casserole after the rescue. I ran to help her up. She clutched my hand and squeezed. In that small exchange, there was the rawness of human reciprocity. Sometimes the smallest acts of presence feel like prayer because they participate in a pattern that is larger than us. The vision sequences I had seen in the lab began to show up in the world as stories told by other people. Stories that, once the initial skepticism wore off, started to look like a mosaic. Dr. Sarah Kim, the surgeon, later gave an interview to a clinical journal about the night an irrelevant chore led to a saved dosage. A teacher, Mrs. Elena Vasquez, recounted in a community meeting how she, on a whim, placed a note in a student's locker and thereby connected the boy to a counselor before his home situation unspooled. Miguel, a teenager from the neighborhood who worked part-time at the repair shop, told me quietly that one evening he'd felt an odd compulsion to call his mother despite their fractured relationship. That call had come right before she needed someone to pick up her younger son from school because she had an unexpected health appointment. "I don't know why I called," he said. "I just did." Each vignette resisted grand claims. They were not orchestrated parades of intervention. They were messy and partial and stubbornly human. Yet, when strung together, they suggested a kind of network, an improbable distributed caregiving system, in which small human actions noticed at the right time could tilt fate. There were darker instances too. Not every image suggested rescue. The stone sometimes conveyed sorrowful things. A house burned because a landlord delayed an inspection. A youth slipped into addiction despite intervention attempts. Those scenes sobered me. They showed the limits of nudges and of human cooperation. The overlay of possibility and limitation became for me the moral engine of what followed, to steward the advantage of being noticed without presuming to fix everything. One of the most arresting episodes in the months that followed was the night a woman on the bridge, a place where the city keeps its particular tragedies, prepared to jump. I had been walking, carrying a bag of groceries, thinking of nothing in particular, when a voice in my head, not a hallucination, but a sudden, inexplicable concern, urged me to cross to the bridge. When I reached the rail, I saw a person silhouetted against the river. Something like recognition passed through me, the raw nakedness of someone tired of bearing a weight they had been told to manage alone. The impulse to step forward and speak felt like a tiny nudge that had come from some margin that was both inside and outside me. I spoke first to ask a question that is small and human. Are you okay? We did not share grand theology on the bridge. We shared a conversation about hurt and shame and the difficulty of staying alive when shame corrodes meaning. I have never known the exact source of the impulse that made me walk to the bridge that night. Was it the stone's echo? A pattern my life had been tuned to since being carried from the surf? Or simply the random intersection of a person ready to attend? The woman stepped back from the rail, and a volunteer counselor who happened to be finishing a patrol arrived within minutes. The night resolved without a miracle, but with a chain of human responsiveness that left me shaking in the cold. I didn't know then whether to call the stone the cause. I only knew that being present matters. My relationship with Elena moved in parallel with these small acts. She did not become a believer in the auxiliary story, and I did not try to convert her. Instead, we rebuilt a form of friendship that respected her clinical caution and my newfound sobriety. We went to one therapy session together, not to reconstruct romance, but to practice honest accounting. I told her, painfully, about the ways my arrogance had justified risk and put others in harm's path. She admitted that the trauma of our collapse had changed her too, how she had taken responsibility for another's collapse because it allowed her to feel useful. Our conversations did not culminate in a reconciliatory embrace. They culminated in a mutual decision to be less of each other's crutch and more of each other's mirror. As I took on more consistent practices of service, Dr. Chen kept refining his data. He published, with deliberate and cautious language, a small article in a technical journal about human object resonance phenomenon that described the measurable correlations without leaping into metaphysical claims. He was careful, and for good reason. Science thrives on reticence as much as it thrives on discovery. Membership in the enterprise of testing allowed the phenomenon some stability without converting it into dogma. The more the stone's patterns showed an affinity for nudging human action rather than overriding it, the more I felt compelled to focus on ordinary accessibility. I began a practice I called directed availability, a phrase I liked mostly because it sounded clumsy and practical. Directed availability was my ritual of being ready. Small commitments, like carrying a $20 bill for emergencies, leaving one evening a week open to respond to neighborhood needs, answering the phone when someone texts for help rather than delaying. It was not spiritual heroism, it was deliberate modesty. If the auxiliary network worked through human tenders, then the work required human tenderness to be present. I also began to tell the story to small groups with careful emphasis on humility. I did not present the auxiliaries as replacements for faith or for institutions. I told people the lab's cautious findings, Dr. Chen's tentative language, and the Coast Guard's timestamps. I told them the hard parts, my failures to act earlier in marriages and in businesses, my lawyer's letters, and the nights I still woke with the cold knowledge of loss. My testimony was less a proclamation than an invitation, to be more awake, to notice the tiny openings of mercy we often ignore. From the lab and the logs came another surprising effect, a network of people who began to pay attention.
Not because they believed in glowing stones, but because they had observed, in a dozen small ways, how the world sometimes aligns when human hearts are willing. Nurses shared notes in staff rooms about small, timely acts that saved lives. A bus operator confided in a local forum about the times he had felt urged to stop early. A school administrator started a protocol that made it easier for teachers to report concerns about a student's home life. These were modest, bureaucratic shifts, but they multiplied. They were ways to design systems that made noticing easier. There were setbacks. Some people ridiculed the story. Some accused me of seeking attention. A small group online tried to co-opt the narrative into a conspiracy they called the orchestrators. Those attempts were ugly and reductive, and they reminded me of the responsibility to hold the story with care. The revelation at the center of my life was never a tool for self-aggrandizement. It was a summons to responsibility.
During this period, I met Jeff, a paramedic who had been at the beach the morning of my rescue and had listened to a broadcast about anomalous bioluminescence. He had his own set of stories, times he had arrived at accidents 2 minutes sooner than expected because of a traffic pattern that changed inexplicably. He was not religious, he was practical and a bit superstitious. We shared notes and compared logs. He had seen things in the field that seemed to fit with the notion of small nudges. The right street light cycling green, a nearby vehicle pulling over at the instant someone else needed help. He did not theorize metaphysics. He simply cataloged patterns he couldn't always explain. One of the most striking outcomes of those months was the way the network's effect trickled into the small civic institutions. At St. Bartholomew's, Dr. Sarah Kim proposed a pilot program, a rapid notice charting system that allowed nurses to flag small anomalies in behavior and route them to social workers faster. The hospital staff credited minor reorganizations for a handful of interventions that prevented emergency admissions. The correlation with the stone's images was indirect and partial, but it felt, to those involved, like a way of honoring the logic the stone had impressed on me, that small openings deserve quick responses. There were also private reparations. I took steps to settle accounts where I could. I met with former partners and offered honest apologies. Legal restitution took shape more slowly. There were, necessarily, limits to what I could make whole. But where I could practice moral repair, listening, accepting consequences, relinquishing the pretensions that had gotten me into trouble, I did it. Months later, there was a community event on La Jolla Beach. Not a sermon or a parade, but a quiet public health fair run by volunteers. Tom was there. So was Mrs. Patterson, handing out pamphlets about elder care. Dr. Hendricks had set up a table with pamphlets about emotional stabilization. Dr. Chen came to observe, camera bags slung over his shoulder like someone attending a festival of curiosities. We laid out some of our findings, not to proselytize, but to promote practical awareness of good neighborliness. It was the kind of event that breathed small faith into civic life, hope without triumphalism, accountability without spectacle. That afternoon, as the sun leaned gold over the water, I walked down to the place on the beach where the stone had first hummed in my hand. I sat on the same stretch of sand and felt the sea like a remembering thing. The stone, by then carefully cataloged, sat in a little velvet box beside me. People wandered. Children built their sand forts with the concentration of tiny monarchs defending a kingdom. Elena, who had been helping at the mental health tent, walked over and sat a few steps away. We did not speak right away. Silence can be a kind of mutual respect when words are weapons that have been used poorly in the past. When she finally turned to me, she said, simply, "Are you using it to make you better or to prove something?" Her voice was neither accusing nor naive. It was the practical voice of the woman who had taught me to measure my feelings and to test them for logic. I set the velvet box between us and let the sea be a third presence. "If I'm honest," I said, "I don't know entirely. I know what it asks, that someone be awake and willing. It doesn't fix the past. It wants us to act now." She nodded. "Then do the work," she said.
Don't let it become another thing you use to avoid responsibility. Use it as a reminder to be awake. We sat, watching the low commotion of families and the way gulls flitted like punctuation. The light over the ocean shivered with gold. That day, the stone did not produce visionary images when I held it. Maybe it was content in the weather, or perhaps the most important revelations do their work in quiet human choices rather than in spectacle. I wrapped the box closed and felt, finally, something like a steadying. Over the following year, I developed small practices and systems that gave the stone's revelation practical purchase. I helped start a neighbor readiness program with Tom and Jeff that trained volunteers in how to notice and report small emergencies. It was not a rescue network of angels so much as a civic primer in paying attention, first aid, referral pathways, and a phone tree for urgent neighbor care. Dr. Hendricks consulted on a mental health triage protocol that made it easier for teachers and bus drivers to flag kids who might need counseling. These were modest, human-scale responses, tools, not theosophies. The stone itself went through institutional channels. Dr. Chen retained custody of it for further study with a formal loan agreement and a clause that allowed me supervised access. He continued to analyze its microstructure and to test entrainment under controlled conditions. He never declared any metaphysical conclusion. His papers remained cautious, written with the precision of someone who knows that wonder is not evidence. Yet, he also never shut the door on possibility. He regarded the stone like an intriguing anomaly that could teach us about thresholds between mind and matter. He occasionally said in private, "If there's one thing science should do, it's follow the thing wherever it leads, even if it makes us uncomfortable." And what of the auxiliaries? The word we used, auxiliaries, helped us avoid the violent, impossible task of equating them with God or with the angels of doctrinal texts. In my own accounts, I insisted on a vocabulary of helpers, of nudgers, of light beings that seemed to be adjuncts rather than replacements. When the stone offered the impression that they coordinated with the one you call Jesus, that remained my interpretation, an experiential sense that fit my religious grammar. I always prefaced that formulation with humility. This is what I felt.
Theologically, others could name the configuration differently. To me, it was enough that the impression invited more service rather than less. As the months accumulated, I felt the old hunger, the hunger for scale, for proof, for vindication, subside into a quieter desire to be useful. The rescue had not made me less responsible. It had made me more glaringly aware of the ways I'd neglected the work of repair. I began to mentor a young engineer named Miguel who had been grinding through a pre-accelerator program. He had energy and anger and the sorts of mistakes I recognized as my own. We sat in diners and rewrote resumes. When he faltered in a crucial pitch, I went with him and offered honest critique instead of empty praise. When he took his first small job designing water pumps for a nonprofit, he grinned like a boy who had been given permission to grow. Helping Miguel was not a mystical act so much as a practical one. Still, I like to think a small human hinge in that conversation tilted something otherwise precarious. There were also moments that resisted tidy narrative. A small donor program we piloted to help families in crisis faltered. Resources ran out, and a child we had tried to help needed a different intervention. Those moments stung. They reminded me that the story we had glimpsed in the lab and on the beach was not a promise of blanket protection. They were reminders that human systems are always partial and that moral work requires continuous repair. By the time a year had passed, the rescue at La Jolla had become for me a long apprenticeship in humility. The stone had taught me to listen. The instruments had taught me to ask better questions. The lives that had intersected with mine taught me to refuse simple answers. Dr. Chen kept sending me papers with apologetic footnotes. Tom organized beach watch volunteers and taught CPR on weekends. Elena continued to hold me to standards that sometimes felt like discipline and sometimes like mercy.
There is, at the end of this story, a small ritual I keep. I walk to La Jolla at dawn, the place where I nearly drowned and was lifted. The tide is a different person every morning. The sea speaks a new grammar of sound. I bring the velvet box sometimes, not to summon visions, but to remember the shape of being helped. I stand with my feet on cold sand and think of a single image, a network of small human acts, each one a quiet choice, each one a hinge upon which disaster either turns away or tightens its grip. I think of the auxiliary who moved through water like a current, and the lab equipment that measured frequencies with the patient indifference of a machine. I think of doctors, bus drivers, school teachers, neighbors, and my own messy, repentant heart. To say the story ends with me a new man would be a lie. I remain fallible. I still have nights when anxiety wakes like an old dog sniffing for a fight. I still get angry and selfish.
The rescue did not erase my debts. It gave me a new imperative for facing them. It carved out a moral posture in me. Wakefulness before explanation, service before spectacle, repair before notoriety. If there is a theological center to this account, it is not a doctrine, but a posture. The impression I received that some network of auxiliaries coordinate with the one called Jesus remains precisely that, an impression, a translation my language reached for to make sense of something that moved through me. It is not a claim about cosmic mechanics. It is a testimony about how I experienced mercy. The stone, the lab, the Coast Guard, Dr. Chen, Tom, Elena, Miguel, Mrs. Patterson, these are the tangible actors of a story that edged me away from arrogance and toward care. What I would invite you to do, if this story resonates in the small, dissonant place that good stories sometimes find, is simple and small. First, notice the oddities that have saved you before. A timely call, a stranger's intervention, a coincidence that felt like mercy. Name them, write them down. Keep a ledger of gratitude. It will change the trajectory of your attention. Second, make yourself available in modest, practical ways. Carry an extra umbrella. Learn basic first aid. Be the one who answers the text at midnight. The auxiliaries, if they exist as I felt them, seem to require not expertise, but humans who will act when prompted. Third, treat wonder with humility. It can teach you responsibility rather than provide an escape hatch. If you have an extraordinary coincidence in your life, something that felt too ordered to be random, please share it in the comments. I read these stories. They help me keep my own testimony honest and grounded. If this testimony moved you, subscribe and share with someone who needs to hear that being seen sometimes arrives in small, human-sized packages. The next time you notice a small urging, consider answering it. It might be nothing. It might be the beginning of a new chain. I keep the stone now in Dr. Chen's custody, with supervised access for further tests. I go to La Jolla and leave a small, ordinary offering. Maybe a bag of trash picked up from the stretch of sand, a cup of warm coffee given to a volunteer. Those small acts feel like prayer. They do not guarantee rescue for every human being. They are, at best, a practice of readiness. On the anniversary of the rescue, I walked the beach at dawn with a thermos and a notebook. The horizon was a thin line of silver. The tide made its small old noises. I opened my notebook to a page I had marked with dates and names, and then drew a simple line across it. Under the line, I wrote the 3 words the stone had made me hold as an opt-in rather than a claim. Notice, be available, act. Then I closed the notebook and tucked it into my jacket and walked away from the water, feeling, for once, less like a man writing the end of his story and more like someone handed the beginning of a better paragraph to write. If your life has a hinge, if you have been rescued in any small or large way, become a hinge for another. Tell your story. Offer your hands. There may be auxiliaries at work, there may not, but the human responsibility will always remain.
Look up, acknowledge, and be willing to move when you sense someone needs you. That, more than anything, is what I took from a morning when I was drowning and an impossible thing reached down and pulled me back into life.